The Whispers of September. The autumn of 1944 whispered promises across the Dutch countryside, promises of liberation, of bold strokes that might end the war by Christmas. But September carries its own particular weight, doesn't it? That sense of seasons turning, of time running short, of chances that must be seized before winter settles in. Tonight, we journey to a bridge. Not just any bridge, but a span of steel and concrete that would become the focal point of one of the war's most audacious gambles. Operation Market Garden. Perhaps you've heard the name whispered in history books, or seen it dramatized on screen. But here, in the quiet of evening, we'll walk alongside the men who lived it, who breathed the dust of Dutch roads and felt the weight of impossible odds pressing against their shoulders. Picture, if you will, the vast expanse of sky above the Netherlands on September 17, 1944. The morning sun catches thousands of parachutes drifting earthward like dandelion seeds on an enormous breath of wind. Each parachute carries a British paratrooper, part of the 1st Airborne Division, floating toward what they hoped would be their greatest triumph. Among them are the men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, seasoned soldiers who had already proven themselves in North Africa and Sicily. They don't know it yet, but they're about to write their names into history at a place called Arnhem Bridge. The locals call it simply De Brugge, the bridge. But for these paratroopers, it will become the center of their world for 4 desperate days and nights. The mission seems straightforward enough on paper. Capture the bridge over the Rhine River at Arnhem. Hold it until the advancing British TX Corps can link up with them, racing north from Belgium along a single narrow road. Simple, elegant, and perhaps just ambitious enough to work. But as any soldier will tell you, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And the enemy at Arnhem would prove far stronger, far more prepared than anyone had imagined. Listen, can you hear it? The gentle whisper of parachute silk settling onto Dutch fields. The distant rumble of aircraft engines fading into the September sky. These are the sounds that began one of the war's most heroic stands, a stand that would echo through history as both triumph and tragedy, wrapped together in the courage of ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things. Tonight, we'll walk with them down the dusty roads toward Arnhem. We'll shelter in the houses they defended, feel the weight of their vigil, and understand why their story continues to whisper to us across the decades. A lullaby of bravery that helps us remember what it means to stand firm when everything depends on holding the line. And march to the bridge. The boots of the 2nd Parachute Battalion beat a steady rhythm against the Dutch countryside as they began their march toward destiny, 8 miles. That's all that separated them from their objective. 8 miles of dusty roads winding through the peaceful farmland of Gelderland province. It should have been a simple walk on this warm September afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, commanding the battalion, set the pace. A lean, weathered man with penetrating eyes, Frost had earned his reputation in the raids on Bruneval and in the mountains of Tunisia. His men trusted him completely, and they would need that trust in the days ahead. Beside him walked Major Digby Tatham Water, a man who would become legendary for carrying an umbrella into battle, claiming it helped his men identify him in the chaos of combat. Imagine yourself among these paratroopers as they begin their march. Feel the weight of your Bergen rucksack pulling at your shoulders, 30 pounds of ammunition, rations, and equipment that seems to grow heavier with each step. Your Sten gun hangs across your chest, its metal warming in the afternoon sun. The red beret sits snug on your head, marking you as one of the elite. The road stretches ahead, lined with tall poplar trees that cast long shadows across the pavement. To your left and right, the Dutch countryside spreads out in a patchwork of green fields and neat farmhouses. Cattle graze peacefully behind wooden fences, seemingly oblivious to the column of armed men passing by. The air carries the scent of late summer, cut grass, distant wood smoke, and that particular smell of dust kicked up by marching boots. Your fellow paratroopers move with the easy confidence of veteran soldiers. These aren't raw recruits, but men who've proven themselves in the crucible of combat. Private Johnny Frost, no relation to the colonel, hums quietly to himself as he walks. Sergeant Major Callahan keeps a watchful eye on the younger soldiers, making sure they maintain proper spacing and stay alert. The weight of expectation hangs over the column like morning mist. This is supposed to be the operation that ends the war. the bold stroke that carries the Allies across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany before winter sets in. Field Marshal Montgomery himself has staked his reputation on this plan. 3 airborne divisions dropped behind enemy lines, seizing key bridges while XXX Corps races north to link up with them. But as the miles pass beneath your boots, you begin to notice things that weren't in the briefings. The occasional German vehicle moving in the distance, more than intelligence had predicted. The sound of tracked vehicles somewhere beyond the tree line, heavy mechanical growls that suggest tanks rather than the light reconnaissance units you were told to expect. The Dutch civilians watch from their windows and doorways with expressions that blend hope and fear. They've been under German occupation for 4 long years, and liberation can't come soon enough. But they've also learned to be cautious, to watch and wait before celebrating too openly. A few brave souls wave tentatively as the paratroopers pass. Children peek out from behind their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with wonder at these foreign soldiers who've dropped from the sky. As the afternoon wears on, the column passes through the village of Hilsum. The cobblestone streets echo with the sound of hobnailed boots. Shop windows reflect the passing soldiers, and you catch glimpses of yourself, face already streaked with dust and sweat, eyes alert and focused. The village seems almost deserted except for those watching faces at the windows. Major Tatham Water consults his map at a crossroads, his famous umbrella tucked under one arm. The route to Arnhem is clear enough. Follow the main road north until you reach the outskirts of the city, then navigate through the streets to the bridge. Simple in theory, but you can feel the weight of uncertainty growing with each step. The radio crackles with reports from other units. Some are making good progress toward their objectives. Others report stronger than expected resistance. The 1st Parachute Brigade, tasked with taking the main road into Arnhem, has run into serious opposition and been forced to find alternate routes. This means the 2nd Battalion, following the river road, might be the only unit to reach the bridge. As evening approaches, the column passes through Oosterbeek, a prosperous suburb on the western edge of Arnhem. The houses here are larger, set back from the road behind well-tended gardens. The scent of cooking food drifts from kitchen windows, the simple, comforting smells of home. For a moment, it's easy to forget you're in enemy territory, marching toward what might be the fight of your life. But Colonel Frost keeps the pace steady. Time is crucial now. Every minute of delay gives the Germans more opportunity to organize their defenses, more chance to destroy the bridge you've come so far to capture. The setting sun casts long shadows across the road, and you can smell the Rhine River in the distance, that distinctive scent of slow-moving water and river mud that tells you you're almost there. The weight of your pack seems lighter now, carried forward by anticipation and the knowledge that soon, very soon, you'll see the objective that has drawn you across the sky and down these dusty roads. Arnhem Bridge awaits, and with it, the chance to write your name in history. Holding the line. The first sight of Arnhem Bridge in the fading light of September 17th was enough to take your breath away. There it stood, a graceful arch of steel and concrete spanning the lower Rhine, its roadway suspended nearly 60 feet above the dark water. To the paratroopers of the 2nd Battalion, it looked like exactly what it was. The key to everything. Colonel Frost deployed his men with the practiced efficiency of a veteran commander. A company took positions in the buildings on the north side of the bridge approach, while C Company secured the area around the ramp leading up to the span itself. The massive concrete pillars and steel girders provided excellent cover, and the surrounding buildings offered commanding views of all approaches. Imagine yourself taking position in one of those sturdy Dutch houses overlooking the bridge. The building, a 3-story structure of red brick with large windows facing the river, has been hastily abandoned by its civilian occupants. Family photographs still sit on the mantelpiece, and the lingering scent of coffee and pipe tobacco speaks of lives interrupted by war. You move carefully to the window, your rifle ready, and peer out at the objective you've come so far to secure. The bridge stretches away into the gathering dusk, its steel framework creating geometric patterns against the darkening sky. Below, the Rhine moves slowly toward the sea, its surface reflecting the last light of day like polished metal. The initial German response is surprisingly light. A few scattered shots from across the river, probing fire from soldiers who seem as surprised by your arrival as you are by the ease of reaching your objective. Major Tatham Water strolls calmly along the bridge approach, his umbrella providing a surreal touch of British eccentricity to the scene. When a German sniper's bullet clips the umbrella, he merely examines the hole and continues his reconnaissance. As night falls, the paratroopers work to strengthen their positions. Furniture is dragged from houses to create barricades. Windows are sandbagged and fields of fire are carefully planned and marked. The bridge itself, nearly 2,000 feet of steel and concrete, becomes the center of an increasingly complex defensive position. From your window, you can see other paratroopers moving like shadows among the buildings. Sergeant Major Callahan's voice carries clearly in the still air as he positions men and checks their ammunition. The sound is oddly comforting, the voice of professional competence in an uncertain situation. The first real test comes just after midnight. German infantry, supported by an armored car, attempts to cross the bridge from the south side. The attack develops slowly, the sound of engines echoing off the water, the scrape of boots on pavement, and then the sharp crack of rifle fire as the paratroopers engage. You sight carefully through your rifle scope, picking out the muzzle flashes of German weapons in the darkness. The engagement is brief but intense, a fierce exchange of fire that lights up the bridge like deadly fireworks. When it's over, the German probe has been repulsed and the bridge remains firmly in British hands. Dawn on September 18th reveals the full scope of what the 2nd Battalion has accomplished. They hold not just the north end of the bridge, but a substantial perimeter around it. The buildings provide excellent defensive positions, and the approaches are well covered by interlocking fields of fire. For the first time since landing, there's reason for genuine optimism. The morning air carries the scent of the river and the distant smell of wood smoke from the city beyond. Dutch civilians begin to appear cautiously in the streets, some offering food and water to the paratroopers. An elderly man approaches your position with a pitcher of milk and a loaf of bread, his face creased with emotion as he presses them into your hands. "Dank je well," he whispers. "Thank you." But even as you accept his gift, you can hear the ominous sound of tracked vehicles moving in the distance. The Germans are bringing up reinforcements, heavier weapons and armor than your light infantry can easily handle. The honeymoon period is ending, and the real battle for Arnhem Bridge is about to begin. Colonel Frost establishes his headquarters in a large house overlooking the bridge approach. From here, he can coordinate the defense and maintain communication with the other elements of his battalion. The radio operators work steadily, trying to raise XXX Corps and determine when the relief force might arrive. The plan calls for them to reach Arnhem within 48 hours. But 48 hours can feel like a lifetime when you're holding ground against determined counterattacks. As the morning progresses, the German pressure intensifies. Mortar rounds begin falling among the houses, their explosions sending cascades of brick and glass into the streets. Machine gun fire rakes the windows where paratroopers keep watch, forcing them to stay low and move carefully between positions. You press yourself against the wall beside your window, feeling the vibrations as bullets strike the brick facade. The sound is distinctive, a sharp crack followed by the whine of ricochets. When the fire slackens, you risk a quick look outside and see German soldiers moving among the buildings on the far side of the bridge approach. They're getting closer, testing your defenses, looking for weak points. The afternoon brings the first serious assault. German infantry, supported by self-propelled guns, attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The battle rages for hours, with the crack of rifles and the chatter of machine guns echoing off the buildings and the water below. Smoke drifts across the bridge approach, and the acrid smell of cordite burns in your nostrils. But when the attack is finally repulsed, the bridge remains in British hands. The paratroopers have proven they can hold their ground against determined opposition. As evening falls once again, there's still reason to hope that XXX Corps will arrive soon, that the bold gamble of Market Garden might still pay off. The first day at Arnhem Bridge ends with the sound of the river flowing quietly below and the distant rumble of more German reinforcements moving up for tomorrow's battle. Tonight, you'll rest as best you can, knowing that each dawn brings new challenges and new opportunities to prove worthy of the red beret you wear. Hankand entrenched. The house at Tudor Zwarteweg had been transformed overnight from a comfortable Dutch home into the nerve center of a desperate defense. Colonel Frost's headquarters occupied what had once been a family's sitting room, where children might have played and parents shared quiet evening conversations. Now, maps covered every available surface, radio sets crackled with static and urgent voices, and the steady stream of reports painted a picture that grew more sobering with each passing hour. Major Tatham Water entered the room just as the morning light filtered through the sandbagged windows, his uniform dusty from a night spent checking positions and encouraging his men. His famous umbrella, now sporting several bullet holes, leaned against the doorframe like a peculiar battle standard. The Major's face showed the strain of command, but his voice remained steady as he briefed Frost on the night's activities. Imagine yourself in that room, surrounded by the quiet intensity of men making life-and-death decisions. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, and the tension that comes from knowing you're cut off, surrounded, with no immediate prospect of relief. Maps of Arnhem spread across the dining table show red pencil marks indicating German positions, marks that seem to grow more numerous with each intelligence update. The radio operator, a young corporal whose hands never seem to stop moving across his equipment, maintains a constant dialogue with the scattered elements of the battalion. His voice is calm, professional, but you can hear the underlying strain as he repeats call signs again and again, trying to raise units that no longer respond. Some have been overrun, others have simply vanished into the chaos of urban combat. Outside the windows, the morning brings the sound of German activity, the rumble of tank engines, the sharp bark of orders in a foreign tongue, and the methodical preparation of an enemy that grows stronger by the hour. Intelligence reports filter in through Dutch resistance contacts, painting a picture that would have been unthinkable just days ago. 2 SS Panzer divisions, supposedly refitting far from the battlefield, are actually in the Arnhem area and moving to eliminate the British bridgehead. The Dutch civilians caught in this maelstrom display a courage that matches that of the paratroopers themselves. Mrs. Kate ter Horst, whose house serves as a makeshift aid station, moves calmly among the wounded, offering comfort and what medical assistance she can provide. Her children huddle in the cellar, but she refuses to abandon the injured men who've been carried to her home. In the headquarters, the morning briefing reveals the stark reality of the situation. The other battalions of the 1st Parachute Brigade have been unable to break through to the bridge. The 1st Battalion is trapped in the woods west of Arnhem, fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. The 3rd Battalion has been scattered, its companies fighting isolated actions throughout the city. Only Frost's 2nd Battalion has reached its objective, and now they must hold it alone. The radio brings fragments of news from the outside world. X-Corps is advancing, but their progress along the narrow corridor dubbed Hell's Highway is slower than planned. German resistance is fierce, and the single road north has become a killing ground where British tanks burn like torches in the Dutch countryside. Relief is still coming, but when it will arrive remains desperately uncertain. As you move through the house, checking on the various command functions, you notice the small details that speak of lives interrupted by war. A child's drawing still hangs on the kitchen wall. A crayon sketch of a house with smoke curling from the chimney and stick figures of a family standing in front. A woman's knitting sits abandoned in a basket, needles still holding the beginnings of what might have been a winter scarf. The cellar has been converted into a communication center and ammunition storage area. Runners come and go constantly, carrying messages between the isolated positions that ring the bridge approach. These young soldiers, some barely out of their teens, display a matter-of-fact courage that would be remarkable in any circumstances. They dash through streets swept by sniper fire and mortar fragments, carrying the vital information that keeps the defense coordinated. Captain Eric Mackay, commanding a company on the far side of the perimeter, sends word that his men are holding firm despite increasing pressure. His positions in the buildings overlooking the river provide crucial observation and fire support, but they're also dangerously exposed to German counterattack. The message, scrawled on a scrap of paper, ends with a typically British understatement. Situation manageable, but could use more ammunition. The afternoon brings a lull in the fighting, that peculiar quiet that settles over battlefields when both sides pause to reorganize and prepare for the next phase. It's during these moments that the human cost of the battle becomes most apparent. The wounded are brought to the aid stations, where medical officers work with whatever supplies they can scrounge. Morphine is already running short, and bandages are being improvised from sheets and curtains. In the headquarters, Colonel Frost studies his maps with the concentration of a chess master, contemplating a particularly difficult position. Every building, every street corner, every possible approach to the bridge has been marked and analyzed. The defensive perimeter has shrunk as casualties mount and positions become untenable. But the core objective, the bridge itself, remains firmly in British hands. The Dutch resistance provides what help it can, slipping through German lines with information about enemy movements and dispositions. These brave civilians risk torture and execution to aid the paratroopers, motivated by 4 years of occupation and the desperate hope that liberation might still be possible. Their reports confirm what everyone already suspects. The Germans are massing for a major assault, bringing up heavy weapons and armor that will test the paratroopers' defenses to the breaking point. As evening approaches, the sound of the river below provides a constant, soothing backdrop to the preparations for another night of battle. The Rhine continues its ancient journey to the sea, indifferent to the human drama playing out on its banks. Tonight, as every night since the landing, the paratroopers will stand watch in the darkness, holding their positions through sheer determination and the knowledge that failure is not an option. The whispered conversations in the headquarters continue long into the night. Plans and contingencies, assessments and reassessments, all conducted in the calm, professional tones of soldiers who have accepted their situation and are determined to make the best of it. The walls close in. By the morning of September 19th, the perimeter around Arnhem Bridge had contracted like a slowly closing fist. What had begun as a confident defensive position covering several city blocks now resembled a fortress under siege, with German forces pressing closer from every direction. The sound of enemy movement had become a constant presence. The growl of tank engines, the methodical preparation of assault positions, and the occasional sharp crack of a sniper's rifle picking off anyone careless enough to expose themselves. Inside the shrinking perimeter, the paratroopers adapted to their increasingly desperate situation with the stoic professionalism that marked elite troops. Ammunition was carefully rationed, with every round counted and accounted for. Food had been reduced to emergency rations supplemented by whatever the Dutch civilians could provide. Water came from taps that might be cut off at any moment, collected in every available container against the possibility of a prolonged siege. From your position in a house overlooking the bridge approach, the view had changed dramatically since that first optimistic morning. The streets that had once seemed so defensible were now swept by German machine gun fire. Buildings that had provided excellent observation posts were now pockmarked with shell holes and barely habitable. The bridge itself, still the focal point of everything, seemed to shimmer in the morning light like a mirage, so close yet increasingly impossible to reinforce or resupply. The German tactics had evolved with deadly efficiency. Rather than mounting costly frontal assaults, they were systematically destroying the buildings that housed the British defenders. Self-propelled guns would move into position under cover of darkness, then methodically reduce each structure to rubble with high explosive shells. The paratroopers would be forced to abandon their positions and fall back to the next line of defense, each withdrawal bringing the enemy closer to the bridge. The sound of approaching artillery had become sickeningly familiar. The distant thump of guns firing, followed by the whistle of incoming shells that seemed to go on forever before the devastating crash of impact. You learned to distinguish between different types of fire, the sharp crack of anti-tank guns, the heavier boom of field artillery, and the distinctive roar of the multi-barreled Nebelwerfer rockets that the Germans called moaning minis for their terrifying sound. Communication with the outside world had become increasingly sporadic. The radio operators worked desperately to maintain contact with XX Corps, but the reports they received offered little comfort. The armored spearhead was still fighting its way north along the single road, but German resistance was fierce and progress measured in yards rather than miles. The optimistic timetables of the original plan had become cruel jokes, mocked by the reality of determined German defense. Major Tatham Water, his uniform now torn and blackened with smoke, moved constantly between positions despite the danger. His umbrella had finally been abandoned after acquiring so many holes that it provided neither concealment nor protection from the elements. but his presence remained a steadying influence on the men, a reminder that British officers led from the front regardless of the odds. The aid stations had become scenes of quiet heroism, where medical officers and orderlies worked without adequate supplies to treat an ever-growing stream of casualties. Morphine had run out entirely, and operations were performed with nothing more than rum for anesthesia. The wounded bore their pain with remarkable stoicism, more concerned about their comrades still fighting than their own suffering. The Dutch civilians trapped within the perimeter displayed courage that matched that of the soldiers themselves. Mrs. Terhorst continued to tend the wounded in her house, now serving as the main aid station, despite the constant danger from shellfire. Her children remained in the cellar, but she moved freely through the house, bringing water to the injured and comfort to the dying. When asked why she didn't seek safety elsewhere, she simply replied that these men had come to liberate her country. The least she could do was help them in their hour of need. Food had become a critical concern. The emergency rations carried by the paratroopers were designed to last only a few days, and those days had passed. Dutch civilians shared what little they had: a loaf of bread here, a jar of preserves there, a precious bottle of milk for the wounded. These gifts, offered at great personal risk, represented far more than their material value. They were symbols of solidarity, proof that the sacrifice of the paratroopers was recognized and honored. The psychological pressure of the siege was perhaps as dangerous as the physical threats. Cut off from reinforcement and surrounded by an enemy that grew stronger each day, it would have been easy to despair. But the paratroopers drew strength from their training, their pride in their regiment, and their determination not to let down their comrades. They had been told they were the best soldiers in the British Army, and they were determined to prove it worthy of that reputation. As night fell on the third day of the battle, the defensive perimeter had shrunk to just a few buildings clustered around the north end of the bridge. German flamethrowers had made several positions untenable, forcing the defenders to abandon structures they had held since the first day. Each withdrawal was conducted with textbook precision, covering fire, orderly movement, and immediate establishment of new defensive positions. But everyone understood that the options were running out. The bridge itself remained tantalizingly close, so near that you could almost reach out and touch the steel girders. But German fire now swept the approaches from multiple directions, making any movement across the span a virtual suicide mission. The objective that had drawn the paratroopers across the sky and down the dusty roads of Holland was still in sight, but increasingly beyond reach. In the darkness, the sound of German preparations continued. The clank of tank tracks on cobblestones, the guttural voices of officers positioning their men for tomorrow's assault, and the methodical preparation of weapons that would test the paratroopers' resolve to its absolute limit. But still they held on, these men in red berets determined to honor their oath and hold the bridge as long as humanly possible. The walls were closing in, but the heart of the defense remained unbroken. Echoes in the emptiness. The streets of Arnhem had taken on the haunted quality of a city caught between worlds. No longer the peaceful Dutch town it had been just days before, not yet fully under German control, but suspended in that terrible limbo that war creates. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky, their windows dark and empty, their walls scarred by bullet holes and shrapnel. The morning mist rising from the Rhine seemed to muffle all sound, creating an atmosphere of eerie stillness broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. From the upper floors of buildings still under British control, you could see the full scope of the transformation. Streets that had once bustled with civilian traffic now lay empty, except for the occasional patrol or the darting figure of a messenger. Abandoned vehicles sat where they had been left when the fighting began. A baker's truck with loaves still visible through the windshield, a bicycle leaning against a lamppost as if its owner had just stepped away for a moment. The silence was perhaps the most unnerving aspect of this urban battlefield. In the countryside, battle had a certain rhythm. Periods of intense action followed by natural lulls. But here in the city, the quiet felt artificial, pregnant with menace. Every shadow might conceal a sniper. Every doorway could hide an enemy patrol. The very emptiness of the streets seemed to whisper warnings to anyone brave or foolish enough to venture into the open. Dutch civilians who had not fled or taken shelter moved like ghosts through this landscape, keeping to the shadows, darting quickly between buildings when necessity forced them into the open. An elderly woman emerged briefly from a basement entrance, looked quickly left and right, then disappeared again into the depths of her building. A cat picked its way delicately through the rubble, the only creature seemingly unaffected by the transformation of its world. The paratroopers adapted to this urban environment with the flexibility that marked professional soldiers. Windows became observation posts, carefully sandbagged and camouflaged to avoid drawing enemy fire. Cellars served as ammunition storage areas and communication centers. Rooftops provided vantage points for snipers and forward observers, though they also made tempting targets for German artillery. The sound of water played a constant counterpoint to the occasional violence. Not just the Rhine flowing past the bridge, but the smaller waterways that threaded through the city. A canal ran parallel to one section of the British perimeter, its dark water reflecting the damaged buildings like a broken mirror. The gentle lapping of water against the stone embankments provided an oddly soothing background to the tension of siege warfare. From your position, you could observe the daily routine that had developed around the defense of the bridge. Runners moved between positions during the quieter periods, carrying messages and supplies with practiced efficiency. Medical orderlies evacuated the wounded to aid stations, their stretchers covered with whatever fabric could be found to provide some dignity and protection. Officers conducted their reconnaissance from concealed positions, noting changes in German deployments and adjusting their own dispositions accordingly. The Dutch resistance continued to provide what assistance they could, though their activities had become increasingly dangerous as German security tightened. A middle-aged man in a dark coat appeared briefly at a street corner, made eye contact with a British sentry, and nodded slightly before disappearing again. Such encounters were brief and wordless, but they represented a vital lifeline of information about German movements and intentions. The empty shops and businesses told their own stories of interrupted lives. A bakery displayed yesterday's bread in its window, the loaves now stale but somehow still representing the normal life that war had suspended. A barbershop's pole still turned slowly in the breeze, though its proprietor had long since sought shelter. These mundane details seemed almost surreal in the context of the battle raging around them. The changing light throughout the day transformed the character of these empty streets. Morning brought long shadows that provided concealment for movement, but also created dark corners where enemies might hide. Midday sun revealed the full extent of the battle damage. The pockmarked walls, the scattered debris, the ominous dark stains on the pavement that spoke of violence and loss. Evening shadows returned, bringing with them the promise of another night of vigilance and uncertainty. German patrols had become increasingly bold as their strength grew and the British perimeter contracted. You could sometimes catch glimpses of them moving through the outer areas of the city. Grey uniformed figures darting between buildings, the glint of sunlight on steel helmets, the purposeful movement of soldiers who knew they held the initiative. Their presence was a constant reminder that the noose was tightening around the British positions. The sound of church bells, which had once marked the peaceful rhythm of daily life in Arnhem, had been silenced by the battle. But occasionally, when the wind was right and the fighting had temporarily subsided, you could hear other sounds that spoke of life continuing somehow in the midst of chaos. A dog barking somewhere in the distance, the cry of a child from a basement shelter, the creak of a shutter moving in the breeze. These echoes of normal life seemed to emphasize the abnormality of the current situation. Arnhem was a city holding its breath, waiting to see whether liberation would come or whether the German grip would tighten once again. The paratroopers fighting for the bridge were not just soldiers defending a military objective. They were the embodiment of hope for thousands of Dutch civilians who had endured 4 long years of occupation. As afternoon faded toward evening, the empty streets seemed to grow even quieter, as if the city itself was gathering strength for whatever the night might bring. In the distance, the Rhine continued its ancient journey toward the sea, carrying with it the hopes and fears of all those whose lives had been touched by this desperate battle for a bridge that had become the center of the world. Unseen observers. The rooftops of Arnhem offered a different perspective on the battle unfolding below. A bird's-eye view that revealed both the tactical situation and the human cost of the fighting with startling clarity. From these elevated positions, observers could see the full scope of the German encirclement, the shrinking British perimeter, and the desperate nature of the defense that continued hour by hour, day by day. Captain James Logan had established an observation post in the bell tower of St. Eusebius Church, the highest point in the city. From here, with his binoculars and radio, he served as the eyes of the defense, reporting German movements and calling in what little artillery support remained available. The ancient stone walls of the church provided excellent protection, but they also made him acutely aware of the history he was witnessing, and perhaps making. Imagine yourself climbing the narrow stone steps to that bell tower, your equipment clanking softly against the walls as you ascend. Each step takes you further from the immediate danger of street-level fighting, but closer to a different kind of vulnerability. Up here, you're exposed to German aircraft and long-range fire, but you're also granted a perspective that few others possess. From the tower windows, the city spreads out below like a detailed map come to life. You can see the bridge clearly, that vital span of steel and concrete that has become the focal point of so much sacrifice. German positions are marked by the occasional muzzle flash or the movement of vehicles between buildings. British positions are harder to spot, a testament to the skill with which the paratroopers have concealed themselves. The view also reveals the full extent of civilian suffering. Families huddle in basement windows, their faces pale and frightened. An elderly couple sits on their front steps, seemingly paralyzed by the chaos around them. A group of children plays quietly in a courtyard, their games muted by the awareness that danger lurks just beyond their small sanctuary. The radio crackles with reports from other observation posts scattered throughout the perimeter. Each observer has become intimately familiar with his sector, noting every change in the tactical situation, every shift in German deployments. Their reports, delivered in the calm, professional tones of trained soldiers, paint a picture of increasing pressure and diminishing options. Tango 2 to control, enemy armor moving up Utrechtseweg. Estimate 2 self-propelled guns with infantry support. Control to Tango 2. Understood. Can you observe fall of shot if we engage with mortars? Tango 2. Affirmative. Wind is light from the southwest. Targets are stationary at this time. These brief technical exchanges represent life and death decisions made by men who have learned to compress fear and uncertainty into precise, actionable intelligence. From your elevated position, you can see both the targets being discussed and the British positions that will engage them. A god's-eye view of a deadly game of chess played with human pieces. The Dutch civilians trapped in the battle zone display remarkable ingenuity in their efforts to survive and help where possible. From the rooftops, you can observe their movements. Quick dashes between buildings, signals passed from window to window, and the careful coordination of activities that keep families fed and sheltered despite the chaos around them. A woman in a house near the bridge has been making regular trips to her cellar, emerging each time with items that she distributes to British positions. Bottles of water, scraps of food, clean bandages torn from household linens. She moves with the careful timing of someone who has learned to read the rhythm of battle, venturing out only during the brief lulls between exchanges of fire. The resistance network continues to operate despite the increased danger. From your observation post, you can sometimes spot the signals. A sheet hung from a particular window, a flower pot moved to a specific position on a balcony, or the brief appearance of a figure on a rooftop who makes hand signals before disappearing again. These communications carry vital intelligence about German strength and movements, information that could mean the difference between successful defense and catastrophic defeat. As the day progresses, the view from the rooftops reveals the methodical nature of German tactics. Rather than mounting costly frontal assaults, they're systematically isolating and reducing British positions. You can observe their preparations, the careful positioning of anti-tank guns, the coordination between infantry and armor, and the disciplined way they establish fire support before advancing. The psychological impact of this elevated perspective is profound. From street level, the battle feels immediate and personal, a matter of the next corner, the next building, the next few yards of ground. But from above, you can see the larger pattern, the way the German noose is tightening, the shrinking options available to the defenders, and the increasingly desperate nature of their situation. Yet you can also see examples of extraordinary courage and determination. A lone British sniper moves carefully between rooftop positions, engaging German observers and disrupting their coordination. A medical orderly makes repeated trips across a fire-swept street to evacuate wounded comrades. An officer moves calmly between defensive positions, checking on his men and adjusting their dispositions despite the constant danger. The changing light throughout the day transforms your view of the battle. Morning shadows provide concealment for movement, but also create blind spots where enemies might approach undetected. The harsh light of midday reveals everything with brutal clarity. The damage to buildings, the bodies in the streets, and the full scope of the destruction that modern warfare brings to urban areas. Evening brings its own challenges and opportunities. The lengthening shadows provide better concealment for the defenders, but they also make it harder to observe German preparations for night attacks. The sound of engines and tracked vehicles echoes off the buildings, but pinpointing their exact locations becomes more difficult as visibility decreases. From your rooftop observatory, you serve as both witness and participant in one of the war's most desperate stands. Your reports help coordinate the defense. Your observations guide the allocation of scarce resources, and your presence provides a vital link between the isolated positions that ring the bridge. You are an unseen observer of history in the making. A guardian angel watching over the men who refuse to abandon their posts despite impossible odds. Shelter and suffering. Deep beneath the streets of Arnhem, in the cellars and basements that had become refugees for Dutch families, a different kind of battle was being fought. A quiet struggle for survival, dignity, and hope in the face of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The Vermeer family's cellar had become typical of these underground sanctuaries, a space originally designed for storing coal and preserves, now housing 3 generations of a family who had nowhere else to go. Grandmother Vermeer sat in the corner, her arthritic hands working steadily on a piece of knitting that seemed to provide comfort beyond its practical value. The rhythmic click of her needles created a soothing counterpoint to the distant sounds of battle filtering down through the floorboards above. Her granddaughter, little Anna, only 6 years old, played quietly with a doll whose dress had been carefully mended several times during their long confinement. The cellar smelled of damp earth, coal dust, and the close presence of too many people in too small a space. A single candle provided flickering light, casting dancing shadows on the brick walls that had been whitewashed years ago, but now showed the stains and wear of their current occupation. Wooden shelves that had once held preserves and wine now supported the meager possessions the family had managed to bring down from their house above. A few changes of clothes, some family photographs, and the precious radio that provided their only connection to the outside world. Mrs. Vermeer, the mother of the family, moved quietly about the cramped space, checking on her children and elderly mother-in-law with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make the best of impossible circumstances. Her husband had disappeared 3 days ago while trying to reach his job at the railway yard. Whether he was trapped elsewhere, helping with the resistance, or something worse, no one knew. The sounds from above told the story of their city's transformation. The heavy footsteps of soldiers, impossible to tell whether German or British without risking a look outside. The occasional crack of rifle fire, sharp and immediate. The rumble of vehicles passing in the street, their engines echoing off the narrow buildings. And underneath it all, the constant background noise of a city under siege. Distant explosions, the crash of falling masonry, and the eerie silence that followed each exchange of fire. Other families had sought shelter in neighboring cellars, creating an underground community bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence. The Janssen family next door had managed to bring down their battery-powered radio, which became a precious source of information about the progress of the battle. Each evening, when the fighting seemed to quiet slightly, representatives from each family would gather to listen to the BBC broadcasts, trying to piece together what was happening in their own city from the fragmentary reports of distant correspondents. The children adapted to their underground existence with the remarkable resilience of youth. Young Peter Janssen, barely 8 years old, had appointed himself the official lookout, making careful trips up the cellar stairs to peer through the coal chute and report on conditions in the street above. His whispered descriptions became the primary source of intelligence for the families below. British soldiers in the house across the street, German truck passed going toward the bridge. Mrs. Backer from number 12 is hanging laundry, so it must be safe for now. Food had become the central preoccupation of daily life. The families had brought down what supplies they could when the fighting began, but those stocks were dwindling rapidly. A loaf of bread was divided with mathematical precision, each slice carefully rationed to last as long as possible. A jar of jam became a treasure to be savored one tiny spoonful at a time. Water came from the single tap in the Vermeer cellar, but there was always the fear that the mains might be cut by shell fire or that the Germans might shut off supplies to pressure the British defenders. The psychological challenges of their confinement were as difficult as the physical privations. The constant stress of not knowing what was happening above, the fear for family members who might be trapped elsewhere, and the claustrophobic atmosphere of too many people in too small a space tested everyone's patience and resilience. Arguments flared over trivial matters: the allocation of sleeping space, the rationing of candles, the volume of whispered conversations that might be overheard by hostile ears. But there were also moments of unexpected grace and humanity. Grandmother Vermeer told stories to the children, drawing on a lifetime of experience to create tales that transported young minds away from their current predicament. Mr. Janssen, a schoolteacher in peacetime, organized quiet lessons for the children, using scraps of paper and charcoal to teach mathematics and geography. These activities provided structure and normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. The adults took turns maintaining watch, listening for changes in the sounds above that might indicate new dangers or opportunities. They developed an intimate knowledge of the battle's rhythm, the times when it was relatively safe to venture upstairs for supplies, the periods when German patrols were most likely to be moving through their street, and the signs that indicated when British forces might be operating in their area. Medical care became a community responsibility shared among the families. Mrs. Janssen had some nursing experience and became the unofficial medical officer for their small underground community. She treated minor injuries with supplies scavenged from upstairs medicine cabinets, comforted children who woke crying from nightmares, and provided what psychological support she could for adults struggling with the stress of their situation. The sound of British voices in the street above brought mixed emotions: hope that liberation might be at hand, but also fear that their area might become a battlefield. When paratroopers established a position in the house next door, the families could hear their movements and quiet conversations through the walls. Occasionally, a British soldier would appear at their cellar entrance, checking on their welfare and asking about German activity in the area. These brief encounters provided reassurance that they had not been forgotten, but also emphasized their vulnerability as civilians caught in the middle of a military operation. As the days passed and the battle showed no signs of ending, the families in the cellars faced increasingly difficult decisions. Should they try to evacuate to safer areas, risking exposure to street fighting? Should they attempt to make contact with relatives in other parts of the city? How long could they survive on their dwindling supplies? These questions had no easy answers, and each family had to weigh their options based on incomplete information and uncertain prospects. The children, perhaps sensing the adults' anxiety, became quieter and more subdued as their confinement continued. Little Anna stopped asking when they could go back upstairs to their real home. Peter's reports from his lookout post became more matter-of-fact, less tinged with the excitement that had initially marked his role as the group's scout. They were learning, at far too young an age, that the adult world could be dangerous and unpredictable. Through it all, the steady click of Grandmother Vermeer's knitting needles continued, a sound that represented continuity, hope, and the determination to maintain human dignity even in the most difficult circumstances. And the cost of courage. The ancient stones of St. Eusebius Church had witnessed centuries of human joy and sorrow, but nothing in its long history had prepared it for its current role as a makeshift hospital for the wounded defenders of Arnhem Bridge. The nave, where generations of Dutch families had celebrated marriages and mourned their dead, now echoed with the quiet sounds of medical care provided under impossible circumstances. The whispered conversations between doctor and patient, the soft footsteps of volunteer nurses moving between stretchers, and the occasional muffled cry of pain from someone whose wounds had overwhelmed the meager supply of morphine. Dr. Graham Warwick, the chief medical officer of the 1st Airborne Division, moved through the improvised ward with the calm efficiency of a man who had learned to focus entirely on what could be done rather than dwelling on what was impossible. His medical bag, now supplemented by supplies scavenged from Dutch pharmacies and donated by local civilians, contained pitifully inadequate resources for treating the stream of casualties that arrived hourly from the shrinking perimeter around the bridge. The wounded lay on stretchers arranged between the wooden pews, each man positioned to provide maximum comfort while allowing the medical staff to move efficiently between them. Blankets donated by Dutch families provided warmth and a measure of dignity, though the church's stone walls and floor made it impossible to maintain the warmth that would have aided recovery. Candles and oil lamps provided flickering light that cast long shadows across the vaulted ceiling, creating an atmosphere that was both solemn and somehow appropriate for the gravity of the situation. Sergeant Major Callahan, wounded in the leg during a German assault on his position, refused to remain on his stretcher despite Dr. Warwick's orders. Instead, he had appointed himself the unofficial coordinator of the walking wounded, organizing those who could still function into useful activities, maintaining watch, distributing what food was available, and providing encouragement to the more seriously injured. His gruff voice, weakened by pain but still commanding, could be heard throughout the church as he went about his self-appointed duties. The Dutch women who had volunteered to serve as nurses displayed courage that matched that of the soldiers they tended. Mrs. Terhorst, whose own house had been destroyed by shellfire, worked tirelessly to comfort the wounded and dying. She spoke little English, but her gentle touch and compassionate presence transcended language barriers. When morphine ran out entirely, she would sit beside the most seriously wounded, holding their hands and humming Dutch lullabies that seemed to provide comfort beyond the reach of medicine. The medical supplies told their own story of resourcefulness born of desperation. Bandages had been improvised from bedsheets and clothing. Antiseptic was rationed drop by precious drop, supplemented by whatever alcohol could be found in the surrounding houses. Surgical instruments, when they were available at all, were sterilized over candle flames in a process that would have horrified peacetime medical professionals but represented the best that could be managed under the circumstances. Young Private Henderson, barely 19 years old and wounded in both legs during the defense of a key intersection, had become something of a mascot for the makeshift hospital. Despite his injuries, he maintained the cheerful disposition that had made him popular with his mates, regaling anyone who would listen with increasingly elaborate stories about his hometown in Yorkshire. His resilience in the face of pain and uncertainty provided inspiration for others whose wounds were less serious, but whose spirits had been more severely damaged by the prolonged stress of the siege. The sound of battle filtered into the church through its ancient walls, providing a constant reminder of the ongoing struggle just streets away. Each new exchange of fire brought the possibility of fresh casualties, straining resources that were already stretched beyond their limits. The medical staff had learned to distinguish between different types of incoming fire. The sharp crack that meant sniper activity and the heavier boom that indicated artillery, each requiring different preparations and precautions. Communication with the outside world had become increasingly sporadic, but occasionally reports would filter in about the progress of XX Corps fighting its way north along Hell's Highway. These fragmentary updates were shared carefully among the wounded, providing hope that relief might still arrive despite the increasingly desperate situation. The men clung to these reports like lifelines, discussing and analyzing every detail for signs that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The spiritual dimension of their sanctuary was not lost on either the wounded or their caregivers. Captain Thompson, a company commander wounded during a night patrol, spent long hours studying the stained glass windows that depicted scenes from the life of Christ. He found particular comfort in the image of the Good Samaritan, seeing parallels between that ancient story of compassion and the care being provided by Dutch civilians who had risked their own safety to help wounded British soldiers. Food had become as precious as medicine, with each meal carefully planned to provide maximum nutrition from minimal resources. Dutch families continued to share what little they had, appearing at the church doors with offerings that represented significant sacrifice. A pot of soup made from carefully hoarded vegetables, a loaf of bread that might have fed a family for 2 days, or a precious jar of preserves that had been saved for a special occasion that might never come. The psychological care of the wounded proved as important as their physical treatment. Many of the men struggled with guilt about leaving their comrades still fighting in the perimeter, even though their wounds made continued combat impossible. Dr. Warwick and his staff spent considerable time reassuring these soldiers that they had done their duty and that their current focus should be on recovery rather than self-recrimination. The nights were perhaps the most difficult times in the makeshift hospital. Pain seemed more intense in the darkness, and the sounds of battle appeared closer and more threatening. The volunteer nurses worked in shifts, ensuring that someone was always available to provide comfort and reassurance. Their presence made the difference between despair and hope for many of the wounded, proving that healing involved far more than medical technique. As the siege continued and casualties mounted, the church began to take on the character of a small community, bound together by shared suffering and mutual support. The wounded looked after each other, sharing not just physical resources but emotional strength. Stories were told and retold, letters were dictated for those unable to write, and quiet conversations provided the human connection that proved as vital as any medical treatment. The cost of courage was measured not just in the wounds that brought men to this sanctuary, but in the determination of everyone, patients, medical staff, and volunteers, to maintain their humanity and dignity in circumstances that tested both to their limits. Hatard Legacy of Arnhem. The morning mist rising from the Rhine on September 21st carried with it the weight of 4 days and nights that had tested the limits of human endurance and courage. The battle for Arnhem Bridge was drawing to its inevitable close, not in the triumph that had been hoped for, but in the kind of heroic last stand that would be remembered long after the tactical details had faded from military textbooks. Colonel Frost, wounded now and barely able to stand, surveyed what remained of his defensive perimeter from the window of his battered headquarters. The buildings that had sheltered his men were ruins, their walls pockmarked with shell holes and blackened by fire. The streets that had witnessed such determined defense were littered with the debris of urban combat. Yet the bridge itself, that vital span of steel and concrete that had drawn them across the sky and into this cauldron, remained intact, still tantalizingly close, still the symbol of everything they had fought to achieve. The decision to surrender came not from any failure of will, but from the simple arithmetic of warfare. Ammunition was exhausted, medical supplies were gone. The wounded outnumbered those still able to fight. Food and water had been reduced to the barest minimum necessary for survival. Most importantly, the relief that had been promised. XXX Corps, fighting its way north along that single narrow road, had been stopped just short of its objective by German resistance that proved stronger and more determined than anyone had anticipated. The German officers who accepted the surrender displayed the professional respect that soldiers reserve for worthy opponents. SS Oberfuhrer Harzer, commanding the German forces in Arnhem, personally visited the British positions to pay his respects to Colonel Frost and his men. "You have fought magnificently," he told the wounded British commander, words that carried special weight coming from an enemy who had experienced their determination firsthand. The paratroopers who emerged from their positions bore little resemblance to the confident soldiers who had landed just 4 days earlier. Their uniforms were torn and blackened, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and marked by the strain of prolonged combat. Yet they maintained their military bearing, forming up in proper order despite their wounds and weariness, demonstrating that their spirit remained unbroken even in defeat. The Dutch civilians who had shared their ordeal watched from windows and doorways as the paratroopers were led away into captivity. Many wept openly, not just for the failure of liberation, but for the sacrifice of these young men who had risked everything in an attempt to free their country. Mrs. Terhorst, exhausted from her days of caring for the wounded, stood in the doorway of the ruined church and blessed each passing soldier, her whispered words of gratitude carrying across the morning air. The cost had been enormous. Of the 740 men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion who had begun the march to Arnhem Bridge, fewer than 200 remained unwounded. The other battalions of the 1st Airborne Division had suffered similar casualties in their attempts to break through to the bridge or establish defensive positions elsewhere in the area. Operation Market Garden, the bold gamble that was supposed to end the war by Christmas, had failed in its primary objective. Yet even in failure, something profound had been achieved. The stand at Arnhem Bridge had demonstrated that ordinary men, properly trained and led, could accomplish extraordinary things when called upon to do so. The paratroopers had held their positions far longer than anyone had thought possible, buying precious time for other operations and proving that the German army, formidable as it remained, was not invincible. The strategic consequences of the battle would be debated by historians for decades to come. Some would argue that Market Garden was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Too ambitious, too dependent on optimistic assumptions about German strength and capabilities. Others would contend that it came tantalizingly close to success and might have shortened the war significantly if key elements had developed differently. But for the men who fought at Arnhem Bridge, such debates mattered less than the bonds they had forged with each other and with the Dutch civilians who had shared their ordeal. Letters would be exchanged for years afterward between former paratroopers and the families who had sheltered them, fed them, and comforted their wounded. These relationships, born in the crucible of battle, would endure long after the physical scars had healed. The bridge itself would be rebuilt after the war, its new span rising from the same foundations that had supported the structure the paratroopers had fought so desperately to capture. In 1977, it would be renamed the John Frost Bridge in honor of the colonel who had led the defense, ensuring that future generations would remember the sacrifice made in those September days. The Dutch people, despite the failure of this particular liberation attempt, would not forget what the paratroopers had tried to do for them. Each year on September 17th, the anniversary of the landing, ceremonies would be held to commemorate the battle and honor those who had given their lives in the attempt to free the Netherlands. Veterans would return, elderly men retracing the steps they had taken as young soldiers, sharing their memories with Dutch families whose own stories had become intertwined with theirs. The lessons of Arnhem would influence military thinking for generations. The importance of reliable communications, the need for adequate logistical support, the dangers of overextended supply lines. All these tactical and strategic insights would be studied and incorporated into future operations. But perhaps the most important lesson was simpler and more fundamental. That courage and determination, while they cannot guarantee success, remain essential qualities in any endeavor worth undertaking. As the morning mist finally cleared from the Rhine, revealing the bridge in all its stark beauty, the river continued its ancient journey toward the sea. The water that flowed beneath that span carried with it the echoes of the battle just concluded, the memory of young men who had given everything in service of an ideal, of Dutch civilians who had risked their lives to help strangers, and of a moment in history when ordinary people had been called upon to do extraordinary things. The legacy of Arnhem would live on in the stories told by survivors, in the monuments erected to commemorate the fallen, and in the understanding that some things, freedom, dignity, the willingness to stand up for what is right, are worth any sacrifice. The bridge still stands today, carrying traffic across the Rhine as it was always meant to do, but also carrying the weight of memory and the knowledge that its stones were consecrated by the courage of those who fought and died in its shadow. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the true victory at Arnhem was not in the capture of a bridge or the success of a military operation, but in the demonstration that the human spirit, when tested by the greatest adversity, can rise to heights that inspire and humble us still. The whispers of September continue to echo across the years, reminding us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to do what is right despite that fear. The river flows on, carrying its ancient burden of memory and hope toward the distant sea, where all stories eventually find their rest.